Chapter 26. Alice smiled quietly as she read the coded message again. She had already read it the night before, when Will had sent it to her, of course. But she saved it to read one more time in the morning light before carefully placing it in the fire that burned in her grate. She stooped before the fireplace now, watching the sheet of paper turn black and curl up in the flames. The paper might be gone, but the message of hope it contained remained clear in her heart. It was typical of Will, she thought, that he would take the trouble to travel miles through the grim trails that twisted through Grimsdale Wood in the middle of the night to send it to her. It wasn't an urgent message. There were no important instructions for her to follow. It was simply designed to bolster her spirits and let her know she hadn't been forgotten. There was a strange veiled reference that had puzzled her. It read, "We have a guest from the land of Cobblenoskin." She frowned over that for several minutes. The name was vaguely familiar, and she searched through her memory for it. Then it came to her. Cobblenoskin had been a character in a fairy tale she and Will had been told when they were children in the ward at Redmont. He was a mischievous gnome who lived in the wild mountains of Picta, far in the north. It was not a reference that would be immediately apparent to anyone unfamiliar with the old tale. Keren, for example. Will was obviously taking precautions against the possibility that the message might accidentally fall into his hands. But she took it to mean that, somehow, Will had captured someone from Picta, and the only possible candidate she could think of was the Scotti general who had visited Macindaw a few days previously. At least, that's what she hoped it meant. The message went on to say, "He's a talkative fellow." If her suspicions were correct, it meant that Will and his allies had learned the details of Keren's plan. And that was reason to smile indeed. But even more so was the other obscure fact contained in the message. For most the part, it was a chatty, gossipy piece, as far as that was possible within the limitations of a brief coded message, designed to keep her spirits up and to remind her that she had friends close by. And now she knew that there was more than one old friend out there in the forest. Since she had assured Will that the stellatite was effective in countering Keren's mesmerism, he had felt it was safe to include another fact. "Love from Tug," the last line of the message read, "and from Kicker and his big friend." Kicker. Again, she trawled through her memory. She had heard the name before. Obviously, Will thought it would mean something to her. Was it an animal of some kind? It sounded like an animal's name. A dog. Not with that name. Dogs didn't kick. Horses kicked. And then, once again, the meaning was clear. Kicker was the name of the battle horse Horace rode. Horace was here. He and Will were working together to defeat Keren. She thought about it now, hugging the news to herself like a warm cloak. Will and Horace working together. Will with his wits and intuition and quicksilver mind, and Horace, dependable, determined, perhaps one of the most accomplished warriors Araluen had seen in years. She had no doubt at all that the two of them would manage to defeat Keren and any number of Scotti. She almost felt sorry for the usurper. Almost. She smiled again, then heard the key turning in the lock. She glanced quickly at the fireplace, reassuring herself that the page was completely burnt. She poked at the coals with a fire iron to crumble the blackened sheet to powder, then rose hurriedly, dusting her hands as the door opened. It was Keren, of course, and her hands automatically went behind her back, her fingers searching for and finding the shining black pebble that permanently nestled in the cuff of her sleeve. But there was no sign of Keren's blue gem, and she relaxed. He had come for another one of his chats. "You're looking cheerful this morning, my lady," Keren said. She realized she was still smiling, still feeling the warmth that the message had brought her. It would be a mistake to try to hide the fact now and adopt a hangdog, miserable air. Keren would be immediately suspicious. He would want to know what she had to be cheerful about in the first place. Instead, she widened her smile and gestured to the window. "It's a beautiful day, Sir Keren. Even a captive can't help having her spirits lifted by such a sight." And indeed she was right. The sky was a brilliant blue, shot with a piercing light and with not a cloud in sight. The frigid air had a clarity to it that brought the most distant objects into sharp focus. The wild beauty of the woods and the snow-covered fields that surrounded the castle seemed close enough to touch. Keren smiled at her and moved to the window to study the view for himself. He put one foot up on the low windowsill. For a moment she had the awful fear that he might lean his weight on the bars that she was gradually weakening with the acid Will had left behind. But at the last minute his hand went to the stonework surrounding the window. "It is beautiful indeed," he said, his expression softening for a few seconds. "I think this is the loveliest time of all in this country." There was that trace of sadness in his voice again, a tone she had become accustomed to in their recent meetings. She knew he was torn by his treachery. It couldn't be easy on one hand to love the country as much as he obviously did, and on the other, to be prepared to hand it over to its traditional enemies. Of course, she knew it made no difference to the land. It would be beautiful and wild and rugged, no matter who controlled it. But the emotional impact must be enormous, and Keren must know that somehow things would never be the same again. But he had made his choice, and there was no point appealing to him now to turn back from the path he was following. She watched impassively as he straightened, taking his foot down from the sill, and turned to her. He made a visible effort to push the melancholy away, grinning at her again. "You're an amazing girl, Alice," he said. "You can remain positive and cheerful, even when everything has gone against you." She shrugged. "There's no point in worrying over things that can't be changed, Sir Keren," she said. He made a disclaiming gesture with his hand. "Please, let's not be formal. Call me Keren. We may be on opposite sides, but there's no reason why we can't be friends." No reason, she thought, other than the fact that I'm a king's officer and you're a traitor to your country. But she didn't voice the thought. There was no sense in alienating Keren by slapping aside his overtures of friendship. Angering him would gain her nothing. Befriending him, on the other hand, might gain her a lot, particularly in terms of information. She smiled back at him. "On such a beautiful day, how could I disagree?" she said, and his own smile widened in return. She thought she saw a sense of relief in him as well, as if he had been hoping that his offer of friendship would not be rejected out of hand. "You know, I've been thinking," he said finally. "Have you considered what might happen to you when the Scotti arrive?" Alice shrugged. "I imagine I'll remain here in the tower," she said. "I assume that you weren't planning on handing me over to them." For a moment, she felt a cold chill of fear. Perhaps that was what Keren was planning. She hadn't really thought about what might happen to her. After all, she was assuming that Will, and now Horace with him, would effect a rescue and get her out of this place. Keren looked slightly wounded at the suggestion, and her fear was quickly allayed. "Of course not," he said, with some vehemence. "There's no way I'd hand a lady of your quality over to those barbarians." "Your allies," she reminded him dryly. He shrugged the comment aside. "Perhaps, but only from necessity, not choice." "Do you think they speak of you in such glowing terms?" Alice asked him. He met her gaze frankly. "I'd be surprised if they didn't," he said. "There's no love lost between us. This is a practical arrangement only. They need me, and I need them. I don't pretend it's any more than that." "It must be daunting," she said, with a certain amount of genuine sympathy, "to view a future where you have no close friends, only companions created by necessity." But her sympathy fell on deaf ears. Keren eyed her coldly, and she realized that he hadn't enjoyed having her spell out the future he faced. "I won't be here forever," he said. "Once I've put enough money together, I'll be heading for Gallica, or Tutland, where I can buy a fief of my own. As a baron, I'll need no friends." It was common practice, she knew, for the kings of Tutland and Gallica to sell baronies to the highest bidders. In Araluen, of course, advancement was dependent on performance and loyalty. But the underlying sadness in Keren's words led her, against her better judgment, to try one final appeal to him. "Oh, Keren," she said, and once again her concern for him was genuine. "Can't you see what your life will become? You're talking about loneliness and banishment, even if it is self-imposed." He drew himself up a little straighter. "I know what I'm doing," he said stiffly. "Do you? Do you really? Because it's not too late. The Scotti aren't here yet. You could send for help and hold the castle against them. Macindaw is a tough nut to crack, and they won't dare go further into Araluen with this castle at their back." "Are you forgetting the little manner of Siron's death?" he asked her. She could say nothing to that, and he continued. "After all, I may not have intended it, but his death was a direct result of my plotting to betray my country. I doubt the king would look kindly upon that." "Perhaps he might be," she began, but he stopped her with a raised hand. "And then there's the small matter of my men. I've promised to pay them, and the money for that is coming from the Scotti. If I renege on the deal with them, how will I pay my men? And if I don't, how long do you think they'll stand by me?" Alice knew he was right. She had known so before she spoke. His next words brought her back to reality. "But we began by discussing your future, not mine," he reminded her. "It may take me 2 or 3 years working with the Scotti to raise the money I need. But when I go, what do you think will become of you?" She had no answer for him. She knew that if Will and Horace didn't manage to get her out of here, She would be facing years of imprisonment, with only Keren's company to ease the boredom. And whether she liked him or not, at least he was intelligent and amusing at times. Once he was gone, what would the Scotti do to her? Of course, Lady Pauline might intercede with the king to have her ransomed. The Scotti might well be convinced to release her if enough money changed hands. And Holt would add his voice to her entreaties, she knew. But that would be setting a dangerous precedent. Couriers, by dint of their occupation, were obliged to go into dangerous and uncertain situations. They lived by their wits, and they survived because of the respect given to their position and the power of the kingdom they served. But if Duncan were ever to pay ransom to have a courier released, it would be a signal to every tin-pot rebel and minor princeling that there was a profit to be made by imprisoning couriers and demanding money from Araluen. All those in the diplomatic service went into the profession knowing full well that if they were captured, they could expect no help from the kingdom. Revenge, yes. If a courier were harmed, King Duncan and his advisers could bring a terrible vengeance on the culprits. They had done so in the past on several occasions. That way, others would be discouraged from trying the same ploy. Of course, if she were dead, she would gain little comfort from the fact that she had been avenged. She realized that the silence following his question had stretched to almost a minute. "I imagine I'll cope, somehow," she said. Keren shook his head. "Alice, you might fool me with that attitude, but I doubt you're fooling yourself. You're too intelligent for that. As my prisoner, you would enjoy certain privileges, but the Scotti won't see any reason to continue them. You'll become a slave, a drudge. Your only value to them will lie in the hard labour you can perform. They'll send you north across the border and sell you off. It's not a pleasant prospect, believe me. Scotti villages are primitive enough. Their slaves' quarters are almost unlivable." Alice stood up, drawing herself to her full height. "How very kind of you to point all this out for me," she said icily. Keren shook his head, smiling at her, trying to placate her. "I'm just pointing out the facts," he said, "before I suggest an alternative. The only alternative, I think." "Alternative?" she repeated. He had her attention now, because for the life of her, she couldn't think what he was talking about. "What alternative?" "You could become my wife," he said simply. "Your wife?" she repeated, the rising pitch of her voice evident of the shock she felt at the suggestion. "Why would I become your wife? Why would I marry you?" He shrugged. The smile had faded from his face at her reply, but now it returned. She sensed that it was less than genuine, more an attempt to cajole her. "It's not an altogether outrageous suggestion," he said. "As my wife, the Scotti would have to accord you the proper degree of respect. You would have the freedom of the castle." He stood and waved a hand at the surrounding countryside outside the window. "And the lands around here. You'd be free to come and go as you please." "You'd trust me not to try to escape?" she said, still staggered by the enormity of the idea and the arrogance behind it. He seemed not to notice the fact. "Where to? We'd be surrounded by Scotti, remember? They're planning an invasion here, not just a simple raid. And besides, if you were to marry me, you would show a certain, shall we say, empathy for my actions. You mean, she said coldly, I would brand myself a traitor as well. He recoiled a little at the word. Don't judge too harshly, Alice. Remember, we wouldn't always remain here. In Gallica, you'd be a baroness with me. She knew she shouldn't antagonize him, knew she should humour him. But his presumption was so enormous that she couldn't control her feelings. There is one small impediment, she said. I don't love you. I don't even like you very much. He spread his hands in a dismissive gesture. Is that so important? How many marriages have you seen among people of our class that were based on love? In most cases, convenience is the deciding factor. And I'm not such a bad catch after all, am I? He added the last question in a light-hearted tone, still trying to jolly her into the idea. Our class, she queried coldly. Let me tell you what class I am. I'm an orphan. I have no family. I do have people to whom I owe allegiance and gratitude and even love. So, as a lower class, lesser being than you, let me say that I do happen to believe that love is important in a marriage. His face darkened with anger. It's that Ranger you're thinking of, isn't it? I knew there was something between you. Alice had spent years training in diplomacy, but she also spent those years training to make her point quickly and succinctly. She forgot the diplomacy now. That is none of your business, she said. The fact is, there are probably 50 people whom I would find easier to love than you. Knights, rangers, couriers, scribes, blacksmiths, innkeepers, stable boys. Because at the end of the day, they would all have one huge advantage over you. They would not be traitors. She could see that her words cut him like a whip. Where he had been angry, he was now furious. He turned stiffly and walked to the door. As he reached it, he looked back at her. Very well. But remember, when you're on your hands and knees in the freezing rain in a Scotti village, scrubbing out a privy or feeding the pigs, you could have been a baroness. He thought it would be the last word, but as he went to close the door behind him, she said softly, the price would be too high. He turned back and their eyes met. There was no more cordiality between them. She had crossed a line in their relationship, and they would never go back. Damn you, he said quietly, and closed the door behind him.